You're lying on your back. It's 3000 BC. There's no city glow. There's no light pollution. There's no algorithm suggesting content you might also enjoy. There's just you, the dark, and an absolute wall of stars overhead so thick and bright it looks like someone spilled something luminous across the sky. And at some point, somebody looked up at all of that and didn't think physics. They thought presence. They thought power. They thought those things are watching me. This is the story of how ancient civilizations looked at the night sky and decided, with complete seriousness and total conviction, that what they were seeing weren't just lights, they were gods, not metaphors for gods, not symbols of gods, actual, literal, living, divine beings, moving through the heavens on purpose, with intentions, with personalities, with moods that directly controlled what happened to you down here on Earth. And here's the thing that most people miss entirely. That wasn't primitive confusion. That was a rational conclusion drawn from the best evidence available. Let's start with what ancient people actually observed, because it matters. The stars are not all the same. Most of them hold their positions relative to each other, locked into the same patterns night after night, year after year. But 5 of them move, they wander, they change brightness, reverse direction, speed up, slow down. The ancient Greeks had a word for these wandering lights, planetes, wanderers. We call them planets now. But to ancient observers across cultures who had no explanation for this behavior, the movement was striking. It was purposeful. Things that moved through the sky with consistent patterns but distinct personalities weren't drifting. They were traveling. And the obvious question, the one that any reasonable mind asks when it watches something move with apparent intention, is who or what is doing the moving? Now, here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because the answer different civilizations arrived at was remarkably consistent. The Babylonians associated the wandering lights with their major deities almost immediately. Jupiter was Marduk, their chief god, king of the pantheon. Venus was Ishtar, goddess of love and war, which is a personality combination that should tell you everything you need to know about how the ancient world thought about those things. Mars was Nergal, god of plague and death, which tracks because Mars is red, and red is the color of blood, and the ancient world was not subtle. They were mapping divine personalities onto observed celestial behaviors. Venus disappears below the horizon for a period, and then returns. So does Ishtar in her mythological cycle. That's not coincidence. That's the myth being built directly from observation. The Mesopotamians kept meticulous records. We're talking clay tablets going back to around 1800 BC that contain systematic observations of planetary movements, lunar cycles, eclipses, and their associated divine meanings. These aren't casual notes. They're administrative documents, official state records maintained by professional scribes at the direct instruction of kings. The Babylonian Celestial Observation Program was the ancient equivalent of a government science agency, except the science was theology, and the findings were reported directly to the monarch because what happened in the sky told you what was about to happen on Earth. If Venus behaved unusually, Ishtar was sending a message. You read the message, you acted accordingly, you didn't dismiss it. Let me throw something at you that reframes all of this. The assumption most modern people carry is that ancient sky watchers were confused, that they saw stars and mistook them for supernatural beings because they didn't have the scientific framework to understand what was really happening. But that's backwards. They weren't confused. They were building a coherent explanatory system using the data they had. The sky was the only phenomenon that was perfectly regular, perfectly observable, and perfectly repeatable in a world that was otherwise chaotic and unpredictable. Harvests failed randomly. Diseases arrived without warning. Floods, droughts, enemy armies, all of it came and went with terrifying unpredictability. But the sky was clockwork. The sky was reliable. It made sense that something reliable and orderly and vast was also intelligent and powerful. That's not ignorance. That's pattern recognition applied to the biggest available dataset. The Egyptians took this in a slightly different direction. For them, the stars weren't just gods in transit. The stars were the afterlife itself. The field of reeds, their version of paradise, was located among the stars. The soul of the deceased pharaoh ascended to become one with the circumpolar stars, the ones that never set, that spin eternally above the horizon without disappearing. Those stars were the immortal dead. The ones that rose and set were the cycling souls moving through their divine processes. The pyramid texts, some of the oldest religious writings ever found, from around 2400 BC, are full of references to the deceased king joining Orion, joining the imperishable ones, becoming a star. This isn't poetic flourish. This was literal cosmology. The sky was the address of the divine. But here's where something even stranger comes in. The stars weren't just worshipped, they were consulted. Across Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, Mesoamerica, and the ancient Indus Valley, celestial observation wasn't a hobby pursued by curious individuals. It was a professional religious practice carried out by specialists whose entire job was interpreting what the gods in the sky were saying. Omens, portents, signs. The Babylonians produced something called the Enuma Anu Enlil, a series of 70 tablets cataloguing thousands of celestial omens and their earthly meanings. If a particular star rose at a particular time, in a particular color, something specific was going to happen to the king, to the harvest, to the army. The stars were speaking. You needed professionals to translate. Now, the question you should be asking is whether any of this worked, and the honest answer is more interesting than a simple no. Because within the framework of the system, it did work, in the sense that careful celestial observation allowed ancient astronomers to predict eclipses, track seasons, time agricultural activities, and navigate vast distances with accuracy that still impresses modern researchers. The Babylonians had calculated the Saros cycle, the roughly 18-year cycle that predicts eclipses, without a single telescope. The Polynesian navigators used star positions to cross the Pacific. The Maya developed a calendar system so precise their Venus cycle calculations were accurate to within 2 hours over 5 centuries. The theological framing was the motivation, the observation was the method. The results were genuinely extraordinary. The Greeks inherited much of this star theology from the Babylonians, and then did something characteristically Greek with it, which is to say they argued about it. Plato believed the planets were divine beings with souls and rational intelligence. Aristotle thought the celestial spheres were moved by an unmoved mover, a divine intelligence that set everything in motion. The Stoics believed the stars directly influenced human character and fate through a kind of cosmic sympathy binding all things together. These weren't fringe positions. These were mainstream philosophical frameworks held by some of the most rigorous thinkers the ancient world produced. When Ptolemy wrote his great astrological treatise, the Tetrabiblos, in the 2nd century AD, he wasn't writing astrology as an alternative to astronomy. He was writing it as the practical application of astronomy. The stars told you things. That was the whole point of understanding their movements. What the Mesoamerican civilizations built around star observation is in some ways the most dramatic example of all this. The Maya tracked Venus with extraordinary precision because Venus was associated with Kukulkan and with warfare. The timing of military campaigns was coordinated with the appearance of Venus as a morning star. The Aztec sunstone, often misidentified as a calendar, is actually a cosmological document describing the divine nature of the current sun and the 4 previous suns that were destroyed by the gods. The night sky wasn't a backdrop to their religion, it was the operating system. The gods who ruled the sky eras determined what kind of world you were living in and what you had to do to keep it running. In Mesoamerica, the stars weren't just gods. They were the mechanism of existence itself. The cultures that developed without significant contact with each other arrived at startlingly similar frameworks. Stars as divine, planets as powerful beings with distinct personalities and domain. The sky as a living system of communication between the divine and the human. Whether you were in Babylon or Beijing, or the Yucatan, or ancient island building stone monuments, oriented to specific celestial alignments on specific days of the year, the underlying architecture of belief was recognizably related. The sky was not empty, it was populated, it was intentional, it had something to say. And for most of human history, in most of human civilization, the most important job a person could have was being the one who knew how to listen.